should be able to share your screen now. Yes, great.
Good. Don't know how many Zoom calls I've done, and it still still proves to be mysterious to me. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. And I wanted to summarize a paper that a whole bunch of us worked on coming out of a workshop that we had at Davis about 3 or 4 years ago. And specifically, it was kind of evaluating some of the latest information I think that we have research done in frequent fire forest types about some of the importance of spatial pattern and what those ideas and some of the research might entail in terms of reconsidering or at least reevaluating some of the planting strategies we have. I think certainly today, in a world in which wildfires are becoming more increasingly frequent and severe, climate change is in the background pushing, and yet we have very limited budgets to deal with this problem. It's worth considering some of the ideas that I hope to present to you today. So certainly one question is, our current reforestation practices, which have often focused on regularly spaced planting, usually of pines, are they well adapted to a more stressful future? There's very good reasons why this strategy was developed. It certainly has a sense of trying to bypass uncertain natural seedling stages and vulnerable early seedling stages by putting 2 or 3-year-old seedlings into the ground. There's a priority on trying to get the crowns of the trees to shade out competing vegetation at a young age. And because of the even spacing, you get very rapid growth in diameter and height, particularly within about the first 20 years. The question is, why focus on tree regeneration quickly gaining site control? Again, very good reasons for this, particularly in Western fire-dependent forests. Most of the shrubs that are endemic to those systems are pretty aggressive at being able to resprout or to sprout from long-lived seeds in the seed bank. And those that shrub community can pretty quickly recolonize the burn area. An example of that is the Angora fire you can see in the upper right, in which the shrub covers almost 100% in that area 8 years after the fire. Because of the competition with shrubs, the density patterns for planting have often been fairly high. And in the lower left, you can see the recommended stocking levels for different forest types that are currently in use in the Pacific Southwest Research Station. If you look at those numbers, though, and compare it to what research has generally suggested were historic density levels in different forest types, such as ponderosa pine, red fir, and mixed conifer, generally the stocking levels that are being planted are anywhere from 3 to 5 times the densities that we used to have in frequent fire forests. And there's certainly some problems with this high stocking level and regular planting pattern. One thing is that it's usually dependent on what I would call course correction, or needing to go in afterwards and either reduce the density or the spatial pattern of the plantation that's been put in there. Usually with pre-commercial thinning or some kind of control of competing vegetation, such as herbicide reduction or grubbing to deal with competing shrubs. The problem with that is that it's been great for, well, I should say it's been great for being able to really guide a stand as it develops into the future. But the problem is the budgets for those course correction type of silvicultural treatments has been pretty rapidly decreasing, at least for regions 1 through 6, about a 40% decline. And you can see in the graph on the right-hand side what the general patterns have been in terms of tree planting, pre-commercial thinning, and release treatments. Certainly without those treatments being done, there's a possibility that you can end up with mature plantations which have a fairly regular planting pattern in them without a lot of species diversity. And I think one of the things that particularly research has focused on over the last 10 years or so is the potential importance of the spatial pattern in providing resilience, particularly resilience to wildfire. You can see in the lower left there a photo from Mark Meyer that shows what the pattern looks like in a Yosemite forest in which you have a restored fire regime where there's openings, there's clumps of trees, and there's scattered individual trees. That pattern appears to be very important in being able to reduce wildfire severity when it burns into stands like these. So with young plantations, certainly there's a lack of resilience to fire. It's pretty well known that in young stands, often up to about 30 or 40 years old, in wildfire, you can get almost 100% incineration of the stand. In drought, the one thing that's going on that of course is somewhat problematic is if you plant at uniform densities, you end up with a pretty uniform competition resource capture area because all of the spacing is regular between the trees. The regular spacing is a great pattern for crop production strategy and for maximizing growth. But given increasing acreage needs for reforestation and declining budgets, it kind of raises the question of, do we need to consider readjusting our reforestation practices? So an outcome from this workshop was this paper, which really tried to propose three main ideas, each of them trying to address what was considered a problem with current reforestation practices. The first being limited budgets and planting crews, suggesting that there might by necessity need to be a triage approach taken in which you would divide reforestation areas into different zones. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the second one is, again, dependent on recent research suggesting that the importance of heterogeneity in these systems, suggesting an objective for planting might be to try to align the forest composition, the density, and the pattern with the two main drivers on forest conditions in frequent fire forest systems, which is water availability and likely local fire behavior. And the third point is to the need to build early resistance into reforestation projects by using early frequent prescribed fire to help restore species and phenotypic selection. So I'll briefly go through these. Here's an example of a post-burn condition in the Eiler fire in Northern California. And one of the suggestions was, given limited resources, to consider what areas you should concentrate both your seedlings, putting them into the ground, as well as your resources for planting crews. And so this is a projection on a fire like that in which you have three different zones. The green zone delineating areas where you're going to get probably a fair amount of natural recruitment seedling in there. And so planting would be reduced in those areas, trying to intersperse trees of different species composition within that natural seeding zone. The second is the area where you concentrate most of your planting, but with a revision to the planting strategy, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which is a combination of regular and cluster planting. And then third, unfortunately, with many of the areas we've got in these really large fires, there are a number of wildfires that have pretty substantial areas that are remote, inaccessible, or have really high costs in terms of both safety and costs per tree of putting the trees in there. So these are kind of indicated by the red zone here in the background. But of course, a problem we have is that if sites are fairly remote or on steep ground, you rarely have a reduction in snags in those areas. They're rarely salvage logged. And because of that, it can be a real safety issue of trying to get crews in there to plant, at least until the snags are on the ground. So the second idea in this revision of reforestation is to suggest that there's a place for trying to instill the more complex pattern that we see in frequent fire forests, this ICO pattern of individual trees, clusters of trees, and openings, to try to incorporate part of that into the way areas are replanted. And so the right-hand side shows a half-acre area planted with a combination of cluster planting and regular planting, where the clusters are specifically put into places that are likely to have higher moisture availability, concavities, places where the slope converges to be able to concentrate water, and that between those clusters, you still are regularly planting trees to try to capture the individual trees that happen in these frequent fire forest systems. But you're also trying to instill a pattern that has clusters of trees in it as well, in the places where the resources for them, i.e. more moisture, soil moisture availability, is indicating where they should go. And the third concept in this reforestation for resilience is trying to restore the Keystone process into these systems early. For those who are out there on this call who've planted trees in the ground, it seems absolutely crazy, I know, when you spend all that time putting trees into the ground to then go back in and burn the stand 15 or 20 years later. But there is a number of experiments now which have been able to successfully put fire back into young stands, probably not before the age of about 15 or 20, depending on site productivity, but still able to get fire back into these stands. And particularly, I think some of the benefits of fire are that you get both a selective process going on that tends to shift the species composition so that it's more congruent with the local topography where the water is available and where fire is going to burn less intensely or more intensely, so that you end up with more pines on steeper, drier slopes, and you end up with fir and hardwoods in areas that often have more moisture in them, which you can see in this bottom right-hand photo in Yosemite Aspen Valley shot. The other thing that's probably going on with fire is a phenotypic selection in which the trees that are likely to survive are the ones that are generally going to have thicker bark, earlier branch abscission, the kind of characteristics that will help make them more resistant to fire going forward in the future. So finally, I guess I'd say for modern reforestation to start creating more resilient conditions, they should really consider adapting the tree composition and density to microsite conditions so that you don't have a uniform planting pattern, but you're trying to bring the forest conditions into congruence with where water is available and what the likely burn behavior is like in particular different microsites. Shrubs will not go away, and shrubs are always going to be a problem in these systems. But I think that if we get a better understanding of how shrubs co-evolved with tree regeneration in frequent fire forest systems, it'll probably point us towards a distribution of shrubs clustered in between tree clusters and openings that suggests that there's a role for shrubs, particularly when fire is frequent in those systems, at dampening the effect of fire to try to reduce the spread and the intensity of fire in young stands. And finally, this idea of kind of initial planting pattern and frequent burning fostering a stand development and spatial pattern without having to depend on costly future treatments, what I would call course correction, that are often needed to restore resilience into young plantations. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Perfect timing. All right, we now have a 10-minute Q&A. So you can put your questions in the chat, and Susie will direct questions to Amarina or Malcolm for us.
Thanks, that was great. We had a few questions for Amarina about the use of the tool. Basically, what kind of audiences do you think could use it? Yeah, you said it was pretty Forest Service centric. Can it be used for planning in the NEPA process? And then alternatively, do you recommend it for private landowners to help them make decisions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it was definitely designed with reforesting on Forest Service lands. And I think the mechanical constraints portion of the tool might limit it in terms of its applicability on private lands. So I think we only prioritize within the Forest Service lands in that tool. But I should say too, part of the reason that we designed it was because we wanted to be able to use it as a way to talk about reforesting with external stakeholders, and just to be able to have that dialogue with people on the outside, and sort of just to get people on the same page.
Great, thank you. The next question was, or comment really, was from Malcolm. And it was really about the need to educate public and policymakers about burning in young stands, not just planted stands, but naturally regenerated stands within wildfire perimeters. I guess, do you have any suggestions on how to make sure that this message gets through? Because like you said, it's hard after planting or even nurturing natural regen to then go out and start to destroy it. You made a great point about that, avoiding future costs, but how should we really get this message across to people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm frankly kind of new at this, talking to different groups, and have had all sorts of various reactions from people, from everybody saying, you know, it's a crazy idea, to it's something worth considering. But at least so far, my experience has suggested that emphasizing that it was a selective process that really the forests evolved with, and putting that process back into the system so that you're reinstilling that selection, I think is an intuitive idea that can resonate with people. You're still going to have people thinking it's crazy in terms of putting all that money into a place and then burning up some of the trees in it. And I can't deny that. It's, as a past tree planter, it got me through my college tuition a few years. It's not something that I certainly would have done at that period of time. But I do think that in the end, particularly in an uncertain future where we don't know exactly how to hardwire in the exact numbers of trees and what species composition they should be and where they should be at, trying to bring the process back into it, I think is a good hedge for us in terms of being able to build resilience into the future.
And then as a follow-up, do you have any specific recommendations about time frame for reintroducing fire? Are you talking about those areas that already currently need pre-commercial thinning as a target, or younger stands?
Well, I mean, I think the idea first came out of some discussions, particularly some work that Rob York had done at Blodgett, where they were able to successfully burn stands from at about the age of 15 to 20 years old. So I can see putting fire into stands under the right kind of conditions at a fairly young age like that. Putting fire into older stands, more developed plantations. I think we're getting a little bit more into the wheelhouse of conditions we know at that point. And so control of ladder fuels and potentially other fuels that might transfer the fire into the overstory of the plantation. I think we've got decent ideas how to do that. The young stand, I think, there's a lot of room for figuring out what the hell we're doing, because frankly, I remember Rob telling me that, you know, they thought, oh, they'd reduce the fire intensity and burn in the springtime. Well, it turned out that bud break is going on in the trees at that point, and they had like 70–80% mortality. So I think there's many little facets to that use of fire in young stands that we're going to have to figure out, and that really need some more research.
Great, thank you. I'd like to suggest, Emilio, that you go ahead and start the poll about this, and we could get people's input as well.
I will do that, and I will share my screen so everybody can see the results moving live. So
thank you. While we go on with our Q&A. We had another question for Malcolm. What do you think is more important in terms of resilience, restoring the historical density or the patchy distribution? Obviously, they're probably both together are best, but is there one that has to be given priority if we have limited capacity to get work done?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'd actually weasel out of the question and suggest that the third option for me is getting fire back into these systems, particularly some recent papers coming out suggesting that stand development patterns in frequent fire forests are not set at all. They're highly variable, so that when you try to engineer structure, whether we're trying to do it by meeting diameter distributions or even by trying to produce these ICO patterns at a set level and density, you know, we're kind of shooting in the dark. And I feel, particularly if we put fire back into stands under current fire and fuels conditions, we're likely to build more adaptation and flexibility into that system than if we try to over-engineer it by, cutting or thinning a stand to a set diameter and distribution. So I guess I'm weaseling a little bit here, but I think that actually putting fire into these stands might be one of the best ways we could to get resilience into them again.
Great, thanks. And then Amarina, we had a couple questions about some of the apps that you shared. One was that there were many relevant management applications, and are they integrated in any way? And then how does the one that you present actually define natural regeneration as being adequate?
So they aren't integrated in any way yet, but I've heard talk of at least putting all of the post-fire related tools in one place. I think that would be helpful. And then the second part of your question was how do we consider whether natural regeneration is adequate? So that comes from that study that Derek talked about. So this was, and I really just summarized it in a couple sentences. But we compared seedling and sapling density to natural range of variation information in order to determine that. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I don't know if the original questioner was wondering if it was some standard amount, but there's no percentage cutoff or trees per acre. It's based on something else.
Right, and I can't remember what the actual numbers are, but they come from the natural range of variation document. Okay. Specifically, we use the one for yellow pine mixed conifer that Safford and Stevens came out with, I believe, in 2017. So it's just this compilation of historical information on stand densities in terms of old data that we have and old sort of accounts from people.
All right.
And this is Derek. I think. Oh, sorry. I think also Susie might also be referring to Postscript and how it quantifies natural regen, and that comes from a big data set of hundreds, if not over 1,000 plots, and quantifies the probability of observing successful regeneration. So observing at least one seedling within a 60-meter plot across the landscape.
Right, thanks, Derek. And so that would be after wildfire.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that pretty much wraps up. We have a few seconds left in the Q&A, but this actually signals a point in our agenda where everyone can take a 5-minute break before the panel discussion, which is an hour. And you can see the comments of the participants scrolling through this Menti poll about how signs can be used to inform management decisions. So maybe we could just leave that up during the break for right now. And we will all come back at 11:30 sharp.